Afternoon, everybody. This is I believe, the last of the Envirothon training Wednesdays, and we're going to wrap up our training with the fourth section of our resources, the Aquatics and Society portion. And my first slide, I took just copied and pasted all of the resources that are listed in your in our resources. So we're just going to go through these kind of one by one. I think I might be a little out of order, but I'm going to try to go through them so that each topic in this section ties together. And then at the end, I'm going to kind of tie it all in with what we've been learning over the last, I guess, since March. All right, so the first topic on that list is the difference between point source and non-point source pollution. And I know we've talked about this a lot, and so that probably means it's important. So this source is a Wikipedia source, and we know not all Wikipedia sources are good, but in this case, we considered it, the Wikipedia sources that we did include, we've considered to be good general information for you guys. So again, we've covered it before, point source pollution. That's the pollution type that you can trace it back to its source. The government regulates it. So think of that Ohio train derailment. That's an example of point source pollution, and the EPA is all over that. The other one category is the non-point source pollution, and that's the pollution you can't trace back to a source. And since it can't be traced back to any particular source, it's hard to hold anybody accountable, and it's much harder to regulate. And so the focus for non-point source pollution is education and prevention. All right. So, the EPA has passed, and the Congress has passed some legislation to help regulate our water. The first one is the Clean Water Act, and that act focuses on protecting the quality of our navigable waters to ensure that they're fishable, swimmable, whatever. So those are the navigable waters. That's different than the Safe Drinking Water Act, which focuses on protecting drinking water sources from rivers, lakes, reservoirs, groundwater. Although the Safe Drinking Water Act does not cover private wells that are less than 25 individuals. And the standards that the EPA sets for the Safe Drinking Water Act are enforceable. But if you look a little closely, you can see that if the Clean Water Act regulates navigable waters, and the Safe Drinking Water Act also focuses on protecting drinking water sources in rivers, lakes, and reservoirs, there is some, they don't always work harmoniously together, maybe both in their legal aspects and probably across agencies. All right, the next one, the source is a USGS PDF source. This source is a little bit older. It's from, I think, 1999, but again, it's really useful for understanding the interaction between land use nutrients and groundwater. So I've kind of pulled some high points off of this, but you're still going to want to read it. I think it's 4 pages, and some of it does get into pretty in-depth, but just kind of try to get the main points out of there. So what I've pulled out is nitrate is the form of nitrogen that's of concern to human health. So when nitrogen is either in the atmosphere or applied through ag chemical fertilizers, it reacts with water, and it is in the form of nitrate. The second point that I pulled out of there is that in many of the streams and streams, concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus often exceed levels that contribute to algae blooms and nuisance plants. So, and we're going to talk about invasive species a little bit later on. And when we're talking about streams, this is mostly streams and groundwater, I guess, is what they've really focused on. That how these nutrients either enter the water system or enter groundwater really depends on how is the land being used. Is it being irrigated, drained? Is it an urban system? Also, rainfall and runoff varies by the season. So snow melt, you can tell, obviously, there's a lot of runoff. However, there aren't a lot of fertilizers and nutrients being put on the land right now. So it's not always a correlation that high runoff always equals high nutrient levels. And also, what's the local geology? What's the land like? What's the soil type? Contaminants move more freely to streams through runoff when there is clay soil or other things like that, or rocks, whereas the contaminants will move through the ground and contaminate shallow aquifers when the soil substrate is very permeable, and that would be like in sand and gravel situations. So and overall, it just basically, streams will show contamination first. Aquifer contamination can take years or decades, depending on, again, like I said, the geology, the soil type, and how deep that aquifer is. All right, the next topic on our sheet is GIS and hydrology. So GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. And GIS is a tool for hydrologic modeling and managing water resources. So think hydrologic. We talked about the hydrologic cycle, and I put a little picture of that on there just to remind you that's the water cycle, how water moves throughout through the watershed and through precipitation. So how does the water move throughout?
3 million allocation appointments. That's saying either put up. There's a saying. Either put up or shut up.
Excuse me.
Have failed to put up.
Excuse me. Can you mute your microphone? Joanne, can you mute your microphone? Okay. Anyway, so hydrologic modeling. I put a little graph on the bottom. This is just one type of hydrologic graph. This is what the USGS puts out for flooding predictions, and so they have traced the river level, the gauging level, and from what it has been, and then through looking at soil saturation and snowpack, they can kind of make a prediction where they think that river or stream will crest. But this is just one example. The GIS software and computer programs are really good at comparing real-time data, so what we're measuring today or at a certain hour, and comparing that to historical trends. Anyway, it's a really valuable tool, and it's through using that, they've been able to make some really good models that compare historical data and current data, and modeling and monitoring the flow of water through the watershed. So, and again, a Wikipedia source, but it's one of the best sources that we've found that doesn't go too technically deep into the details, because it's really, with a lot of these things, I know we talked about it earlier, it's kind of a rabbit hole you can go down. So we're going to keep that one simple. All right, next topic is water resources. So one part about this, and um, um, is where is the Earth's water located and how much of that is even usable? So um, we wouldn't ask you on a test to know exactly what percentage of water is stored in which reservoir, but you should be able to order them from greatest to least and know that obviously the most water on Earth is in the ocean. The ocean holds about 97.5% of Earth's water resources. And that leaves only about 2.5% of freshwater resources left over. And the majority of that is in the glaciers and ice caps. I think of the total freshwater, I think about 60 some percent is tied up in glaciers and ice caps. So that's not usable. Another 30 some percent is in groundwater. And of course, not all groundwater is accessible. And the rest is just fraction of a percent in lakes, swamps, atmospheres, and rivers. So when you start to look at that, it comes out that there's really not a whole lot of water that's even available to use. And of these freshwater resources that we can get to, not all of it is suitable for human consumption. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. So although water is a renewable resource through the water cycle, that doesn't mean that all of it is available. Some of it may be polluted or not easily accessible. But this slide is basically talks about how do we use water, what are some threats to water resources, and is it possible to treat maybe ocean water and use that for drinking water. So so currently across the United States and the world, agriculture is by far the largest use of water resources, followed by industrial. So if you see 70% is agriculture, 22% is industrial, that doesn't leave, only leaves about, what, 8% for everything else. And the water that we do have is threatened by pollution, climate change, conflicts either between countries or even between states, and also water scarcity. So think like aquifer depletions. There's the big Ogallala aquifer I think we've referred to when we were talking about groundwater. A lot of these aquifers have been depleted, and we've a lot of the wetlands that existed to help recharge those aquifers have gone away as well. So is it possible to treat water to make it usable? Yes, it is. So there is water reclamation, which is converting wastewater, sewage, into usable water. And I can't remember where I saw a video somewhere last week that showed them treating sewage water. I couldn't find it today, but it is possible. It sounds kind of gross, but once it's all been treated, it is usable. There's also desalination, which is removing salts and minerals from water, and this would be more for coastal cities. But it's a very costly process, and salt water is really, really corrosive. So although these are desalination sounds like a good idea, I'm not sure if it's economically viable yet. All right, and again, you can visit that Wikipedia source, and I've included the link there, and I'll send them all to Andrea after the presentation. All right, so with so little water available for consumption and use, it makes sense to talk about water conservation strategies and policies. All right, so there are a lot of strategies and policies to manage and protect water resources. And if you visit that this Wikipedia page, it talks about rainwater harvesting, what we can do to protect groundwater, water conservation, fixing leaky faucets. I think I saw somewhere like a no water urinal, which sounds also kind of gross, but hey, however we can save water, low flow shower heads. And then it also goes into different types of irrigation that that they've developed to, since irrigation is one of the highest users of water resources, if we can find effective, cost-effective, and ways of, oopsie, of irrigating crops, that would go a long way. And I also put this logo, this WaterSense logo, and that's part of an EPA program, which the EPA spearheads, and it's just a label to help consumers buy products that are, to know which products are water saver products. So, all right, so that's how we as humans have used water resources. So we've depleted, there's not a lot of water for us, but that also means that some of the ways we've used water and how we've taken them out has also impacted habitat for certain wildlife. All right, so the Endangered Species Act is a federal program enacted for conservation of threatened and endangered plants, animals, and their habitats also. So it's a pretty broad program, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the entity that's in charge of enacting the Endangered Species Act. They're the ones that put animals on the endangered or threatened list. They're also the agency that is in charge of taking them off. So I've listed a couple aquatic or endangered species here. You can go look at the North Dakota Game and Fish website, which I put on here, and also the Fish and Wildlife Service office that is in charge of the North Dakota region. So remember, we're aquatics. If we were to ask you to name some endangered species, it'd probably be something relating to aquatics. So the pallid sturgeon is an endangered species, as is the whooping crane. I guess those are the ones I looked at because those are the ones that pertain to aquatics. The piping plover is a wetland shorebird that was on the endangered species list for quite a while. It has now been downgraded and considered to be threatened, right? Okay, so now we're going to move on to invasive species. And I always liked this cartoon about how we would feel if there were aliens invading the Earth. And invasive species is one of the greatest threats to global diversity after the loss of habitat. So sometimes we don't think a whole lot of it, but it really is a major threat. So the first slide is basically differentiating between native, non-native, and invasive species. So the native species, those are the things that are native to an area. They normally live and thrive in that habitat, and they've adapted they have certain adaptations to the native environment. And their population is controlled by, they have natural predators to kind of as a checks and balances to keep population in balance. Then there are non-native species. So being non-native doesn't necessarily mean that it's invasive. So these are animals that are outside their normal range because humans have brought them there, or humans have introduced them there either accidentally or intentionally. And some examples of this would be pheasants were brought to the United States from China, and people wanted a really pretty bird to hunt. But pheasants aren't invasive because, one, they're not really adapted to live here. And secondly, there are a lot of natural predators to keep their population in check. The walleye is another example, especially when it's been stocked in other lakes. Walleye are native to the Missouri River system in the Great Lakes, but the Game and Fish has stocked them in other lakes. Again, because it's a fun fish to catch, but although they're non-native in certain habitats, they're not invasive because because their population is kept in check. Is naturally, I should say, kept in check. On the other hand, there are the invasive species, which are not native, and once introduced into a habitat, they completely outcompete the native species. They don't have natural predators. They reproduce really, really fast, so their numbers just explode. And they also will destroy the habitat and not make it unsuitable for native species. And once established, invasive species cost millions to control. And we'll talk about it again a little bit later, but I'll say it now, is prevention is the best measure against invasive species, because once they're introduced, they're almost impossible to get rid of. All right, so I've listed some environmental impacts. So they decrease biodiversity, they change the landscape, outcompete native species. Sometimes they bring in diseases that are harmful to the native species. Again, outcompete them, sometimes outcompete native species almost to extinction. They may hybridize, like breed with native species so that they're no longer a pure population and can displace other native populations, and will destroy, impact the natural food web and by decreasing food sources. So those are all some of the environmental impacts. And I've kind of touched on what makes invasive species so successful, but here's just a little bit more about it. They're adaptive. They're very adaptable. They can tolerate a wide variety of habitat conditions, and they grow, reproduce rapidly, compete aggressively for food, water, and habitat. Again, lack natural enemies. Are not susceptible to diseases, but they may bring diseases with them and introduce them to the population. And they are generalists in that they can adapt quickly to new environments. Here's just a quick list of the aquatic nuisance species currently found in North Dakota. I pulled these off the North Dakota Game and Fish website. And I'm going to go through just some of these in a little bit more detail. Some of maybe the more, I don't know, maybe more impactful species. All right, so the first one is Eurasian water milfoil. It came from Eurasia. A lot of these invasive species have been introduced from Eurasia. It's a submerged plant that roots in and grows in really thick, dense mats. And those mats will shade, block out the sunlight, shade native plants. And in our earlier training sessions, we talked about what happens when plants don't get sunlight, is that they will die and begin to decompose. It also means that there's less habitat structure and places for less food for fish. The other one is the curly leaf pondweed, and if you look, their leaves almost look kind of ribbon-like with a stem down the middle or a line down the middle. Another submerged rooted plant, and again, also grows in really thick mats, and it's a real problem for boaters because it can get tangled up in their prop. This one is a concern because it grows earlier in the year than native plants, so they've already deprived native plants from their nutrients before the other ones even get to start growing. And again, I talk about what happens when aquatic plants die off in large numbers. They'll be decomposed and decrease oxygen levels. Another one is the common carp. This one also came from Asia. These carp, you can see this one's really big. It's a bottom feeder, so it uproots sediment and vegetation at the bottom of a water body, and that decreases water quality and habitat for native species. Next one, silver carp is another kind of carp. I think both kinds of carp may have been intentionally introduced to waters before before there were studies showing what how detrimental they can be. Again, outcompetes native fish, eats all the food, kind of destroys the habitat. And then there's kind of the most popular one, or maybe one everybody talks about, that's the zebra mussels. There's a huge public information campaign all about preventing the spread of zebra mussels. And you can see once they've colonized on things, they really make a mess. If you look at the picture on the left, that's an intake valve and it is completely clogged with zebra mussels. All right. And so cities or municipalities that get their drinking water from rivers or reservoirs that have been infested with zebra mussels, it can clog their water intake pipes and be very, very costly to remove them and keep them functioning. Also, if you look on the left or on the far right, you'll see zebra mussels are the only mussel that can attach itself to solid surfaces. And those solid surfaces are rocks, docks, boats. You can see the boat prop, and even other native mussels. And we've seen that a lot in the Cheyenne River, where there is zebra mussels infested in the Cheyenne River, and they do colonate on native mussels to the point almost where they're starting to smother some of our native mussels. So that's also a really big problem. All right, so this last slide is just about prevention. Clean, drain, and dry. Basically anything that's going to go from one lake to another or one water body to another. So clean off boats, trailers, gear, things like that, remove weeds and any other contaminants, drain out all the water to get out any larvae, and dry it off. All right, and you can learn more about the clean, drain, dry, and how to stop aquatic hitchhikers by visiting this link at the bottom. All right, so that was a ton of information in about half an hour. And as I mentioned at the start, I just kind of wanted to include this last slide as how to tie it all together. So I quickly put together this concept map, and if you want, you can write up a concept map kind of like this with aquatics as our concentration in the middle and each of the 4 subcategories that we have. And you can kind of, I put, I guess, the main topics next to each subcategory. And I want you to kind of look at, how do each of these interrelate? How does the water cycle influence wetlands or groundwater? How do humans influence the water cycle, watersheds? How does water quality affect both other abiotic factors and biotic factors and aquatic? So how do all of these things tie together? I didn't have time today to draw any arrows, but it's a pretty simple diagram, concept map, just to kind of get you thinking about none of these topics is a standalone topic. They're all intertwined and influence the other topics. All right. Are there any questions? If you have a question, put it in the chat box. Andrea had some obligations today, and I didn't get a chance to send her any of the Kahoot questions, so that'll be coming probably tomorrow. I'll get those sent off to Andrea, and you can visit back to the Envirothon website and take your little quiz. Are there any questions?
What about salt cedars?
Yes, that one is on the Game and Fish website. That's why I encourage you to go back and look at that. I didn't want to, I knew if I already had a lot of slides, so I didn't want to go too in depth into everything, but yes, the salt cedars are also on the invasive species list. So I encourage you to go back to, let's see, go to this website. So I listed the salt cedars here on this website, or I've got it on this list, but for more information about any of these aquatic nuisance species, you'll need to go to the Game and Fish Aquatic Nuisance Species website. Good question. Anything else? All right, so like I said, I went through, pretty much just went from the sources. We had quite a number of sources listed for this, for this aquatics and society section. And I just kind of went through, picked some points out of them. None of it really is super technical reading, except maybe the quality of our nation's water. But if you read through that, again, it's all pretty straightforward, easy reading, nothing super duper technical. And even though they're on the study resources, I'll email Andrea these sources too, so they'll be along with this presentation. And anyway, any other questions?
Any other
No.
comments? Okay, so thank you, Bonita, for doing this
Yep.
presentation. And it's been actually a joy to do these presentations and to be able to put these resources out for students and advisors to use on how to guide their students. We are one of the few topics that actually encompass all the other topics when it comes to Envirothon. And so with that being said, that means we're pretty in depth when it comes to information. But we think it's important because, once again, water is the life of everything. So whether we're talking about ourselves or we're talking about wildlife or our communities, trees, soil, water's a part of it. So today we are not going to finish this up with a Kahoot. You will be invited to a Kahoot later on this week. We might even make it a little longer this time, just because it'll be a great time to review a few things that we talked about in some of the previous weeks. We hope that these programs have been able to help you understand how vast water education is and how they all tie together in day to day. So if there's no other questions, again, thank you, Bonita, for being my co-partner on this journey here,
Right.
learning about aquatics. And does anybody have any questions or comments? This will be our last time to answer those until we see you out at Crystal Springs.
Right. Yeah, and I hope we've been able to help you kind of weed through all these resources so it doesn't seem like it's such a daunting, I know it's a lot of information, but by doing this, we were hoping to kind of make it look a little more, make it seem not so daunting, and that it is doable, and kind of, I guess, kind of go through all the resources with you. I know your study time might be limited, so I hope this helped you along the way.